What if 9/11 did not occur in America, but in France? I will break down the effects upon America and France individually. Hope you enjoy. America would be a vastly different country without 9/11. However, briefly I will point out some things always stay the same, and this is definitely the case in this example. America would still invade Afghanistan and Iraq, citing the terrorist threat from the attacks that had occurred in France, which would still traumatize the world. This is because 1. Afghanistan was still an active threat, where Al-Qaeda would have been still based, and thus the Americans would have seen it as in their interest to take them out. Secondly, they still would have invaded Iraq, because there is no evidence that the American administration chose to invade Iraq because of the 9/11 attacks. That was not their motive. The evidence shows that they always were intending to invade Iraq, but just wanted an excuse. Onto things that would be different, though, is that socially America would be less scarred from this very traumatic attack that occurred on the country. However, in this world, as the attack wasn't directly upon the US, but the US would still invade Iraq and Afghanistan, this means that there would be an even larger anti-war movement in the US, thus leading to even less trust in the US government in this timeline. However, the anti-war movement in Europe would be weaker as Europe had been directly attacked in 9/11 this time. Now, the effect of a larger anti-war movement in the US would have three major effects. The first is that this increased shadiness in US involvement in the two wars would likely lead to Bush's defeat in the 2004 election to Kerry, which had been predicted at the time by pundits. However, to the shock of these political pundits, Kerry actually lost. The second effect on the US would be support for the US internationally, particularly in Europe, would be higher, as the US would have been perceived to be actively protecting its allies, in this case Europe and France, and thus US alliances with countries like France and Germany would be strengthened in this timeline, in comparison to the fragile state they are in now. And the final effect would that there would be an earlier US withdrawal from Iraq. This would likely happen in 2005, as Kerry would likely run on a platform of withdrawing from Iraq. However, withdrawal from Afghanistan is harder to predict, as the US public may still see it as in their interest to stay in Afghanistan, or the French may apply diplomatic pressure for the Americans to stay. Thus, it would be in their interests to stay in Afghanistan as to keep their European allies happy. The effects on France in this timeline would be massive, and at this point I will explain how the attacks would have occurred and how this world's timeline would kind of flow. So firstly, the attacks would have been completely different in layout compared to the attacks on America in our timeline, given the geography of France, which does not have many tall buildings, or tall buildings that are significant symbols to take out, because we have to remember that Osama bin Laden planned the attacks to take out key symbols of what represented the country, and he used planes to do this, which would kill a lot of people. However, this just wouldn't work in France. However, there would still likely be two plane crashings. That would be the Eiffel Tower and French Parliament, which are symbols of France and its values, and also are large enough that they would cause enough damage to be significant to the country. However, what the attacks would likely take out the form of lone gunmen killing people in the streets of cities such as Paris, Lyon, Marseille, etc. This would be reminiscent of our world's November 2015 Paris attacks, which killed around 200 people. Now, how many people would die in these attacks from the lone gunmen and the plane crashings? Well, that's hard to predict. However, given the scale of the November 2015 Paris attacks, with not that many gunmen, and people knew about terrorism back then, about the threat, so there was a lot more security and SWAT preparation for this, the casualties would likely be very high. For the sake of the argument, we'll say it's about our world's 9/11. We'll use that as a base, so we can compare the US to French response more equitably. So, not only would these attacks create great trauma in the French public, as seen in the US public, but these attacks being carried out all across France by multiple assailants would completely shock the nation. It would really give the image that France was being attacked to an even greater extent than the American 9/11 attacks had, given the scope of these attacks, and how they wouldn't just happen in one instant where the sudden shock comes in. It would be a constant fear that maybe the next gunman will hit in your town, in your street, in your suburb. In this world, the assailants would too still be likely from Saudi Arabia, as occurred in 9/11, in majority. However, a substantial chunk would also likely be Algerian, and thus in 9/11, the French government in France's 9/11, the French government would likely blame Algeria and Algerians for the attack. This would result in extreme xenophobia and retaliation by the French public against their substantial Algerian population. France, a nation already traumatized by world wars, and now this, would culturally likely turn to extreme aggression and retaliation against Algeria and Algerians. We can see an example of this in the response by France to the beheading of a teacher last year, and how following this, Emmanuel Macron emphasized France's values of secularism, the French state, and so on. So this would likely lead to an acceleration of these trends we're seeing in modern-day France, such as the rise of the far right and increasing restrictions on Islam in France, and general more radicalism, such as a mosque construction ban or a hijab ban may be implemented in France following these attacks. In the long term, these cultural effects would lead to Europe rejecting refugees, especially Syrians, during the refugee crisis of the 2010s, as France was directly attacked by radical Islamic terror. Following these attacks, France would call for massive retaliation, and thus France would likely invade Algeria and Libya, along with the European Union nations. Libya would be attacked as Gaddafi supported terrorism, and thus would be blamed for these attacks, such as we've seen historically Libya sponsored the blowing up of an airliner over Scotland, while the USA would simultaneously invade Afghanistan with its Atlantic allies, such as Australia, Canada, and New Zealand. The French invasion would be successful as France and the EU would overwhelm a country already in civil war, and Libya would also not be able to resist, given its inferiority in both population number and firepower to Europe and France. French occupation would likely remain to the present day, and it would be like the French Afghanistan, with more public support, as the French would be able to pull on residual support from the previous French colonial regime in Algeria. The Algerians, a lot of Algerians also speak French, so it means they would be able to communicate with the locals. The French also have a large Pied Noir and Algerian population who could move back into Algeria and help administer it, so it would be less like a foreign occupation in a sense. And as France occupation would lengthen, France would also begin to implement its own institutions and values into the country, such as secularism, which would be much more effective given their proximity to Algeria and their previous experience in administering Algeria. There would even be calls in France to reintegrate Algeria into France. So in a sense, a return to colonialism, recolonialism. This would become a movement in France. As the years would go on, France would begin to be alienated from the rest of the world given their occupation of Algeria, which would begin to appear more like colonialism. However, in France, the support for the stay would continue to strengthen, as France would be able to gain resources from Algeria, such as oil, and also exact retribution for the attacks that had occurred on the state. As we get into the 2010s, the Arab Spring would spark. Though French rule would be seriously challenged and violence would increase in French Algeria, they would continue to stay. The Arab Springs would seem to the French to have emphasized the need to stay. In addition, France would have left Libya by now, and once Libya would have fallen during the Arab Spring, this would further emphasize the importance of staying in Algeria. Thus, to the modern day, Algeria would be administered by France. Would this be a colonial regime? Who knows? But what we do know is that in this world, French Algeria still exists.